Good day, everyone. Welcome to another day of learning. I am Jacqueline E. Ehe, and today I will report about behaviorism, particularly Watson's theory and Skinner's theory. At the end of this video, you'll recognize the learning theories in a behaviorist perspective and understand the behaviorist perspective of Watson's theory and Skinner's theory. Let's start. The behaviorism as an approach to learning, as we know that psychology have different schools of thoughts that have influences our knowledge, perception, and our understanding of various aspects of psychology. The main schools of thoughts are structuralism, through which psychology try to understand the structure or characteristics of our mind. Next is functionalism. And the third one is behaviorism, which emphasizes our learning of behavior. And there is also another school of thoughts, which is psychoanalysis, cognitive psychology, gestalt psychology, and lastly, humanistic psychology, which will be tackled in the next reporter. Out of these schools of thought today, I will discuss behaviorism. First of all, a question comes to our mind. What is behavior? Behavior consists of reactions and movements that an organism gives and does during a certain situation. According to behavior's approach, nobody is good or bad from birth. It depends what kind of environment, experiences, and situations one is getting, and accordingly, behaviors are acquired. Now, the next important concept is behaviorism. Behaviorism is an approach to psychology which emphasizes that all behaviors can be learned or acquired through interaction with the environment. If we look back into the history of behaviorist approach, there was an article, Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It. This article was written by the famous psychologist J.B. Watson. J.B. Watson, or John B. Watson, who is also considered as the father of behaviorism. In this paper, he outlined the behaviorism as an objective branch of science. He clearly states that it is not scientific for psychologists to study an observable phenomena, rather measurability and observability of human behaviors are more important. Now, this concept of behaviorism is very helpful when we take it as a source of learning. John B. Watson claimed that if he were to be given a dozen healthy infants, he could shape them into anything: doctors, lawyers, artists, beggars, or thieves, regardless of their background or genetic predisposition. First, he completed experiments with 8-month-old Albert, which he calls it the little Albert, and later he applied his theory when raising his own children. In essence, he applied the scientific method to human psychology, which he called behaviorism. With the little Albert experiment, Watson used the method of classical condition, which is Pavlov's theory, to program a baby to be afraid of a lab rat. Earlier, Pavlov demonstrated how conditioning can trigger biological responses that are inherited genetically. Watson's hypothesized that we can also instill new behaviors that were not inherited. To conduct the experiment, Watson and his assistant, Rosalie Rayner, placed the boy in a room where a white rat was allowed to roam around. First, the boy showed no fear. Then Rainer struck a steel bar with a hammer every time Albert reached out to touch the rat, scaring Albert and causing him to cry. Eventually, Albert tried to get away from the rat, showing that he had been conditioned to fear the rat. Weeks later, Albert showed distress towards any furry object, showing that his conditioning had not only been sustained but also generalized. Watson assumed that our behavior is either a reflex evoked by a stimulus or a consequence of our individual history of earlier exposure to reinforcement and punishment paired with our current motivational states and stimuli. Unlike Freud and Jung, he was not interested in thoughts or the mind because, in his opinion, the analysis of actions and reactions were the only way to apply the scientific method of psychology and get objective insights into human behavior. He thought of psychology as an objective branch of natural science, its goal and the prediction and the control of behavior. Like his fellow behaviorists, he believed that intelligence, temperament, and personality are determined by the environment in which the child is raised.
Watson published The Psychological Care of Infant and Child. In his book, he advised parents not to touch their children too often and to keep an emotional distance so as not to spoil them. Playing with children, he warned, would interrupt their routines. A happy child doesn't cry or seek attention. His book became a bestseller, and soon other scientists of his time advised against showing affection. Some Western governments started to hand out leaflets advising that parents should stop kissing their children. Parents developed the idea that children should be left to sit quietly during the day and night. They should be left crying alone until they fall asleep, a method called sleep training. Watson, who had a difficult childhood, wanted to be a good father and applied his methods to his 4 children, John, Mary, James, and William. Unfortunately, things didn't turn out as planned. John complained throughout his entire life about intolerable headaches and died early in his 50s. Mary developed a drinking problem and attempted suicide, like her brother James. William took his own life at age 40. Watson allegedly admitted that he regretted writing about child rearing as he realized he didn't know enough about it to do so. Towards the end of his life, he became reclusive, and prior to his death in 1958, he burned all of his recent papers. What do you think? Watson was convinced that the kind of nurturing we received can determine our life path, claiming that he could turn an infant into any man he wishes. In his own family, though depression and bad habits were passed on from generation to generation. Thus, this happened due to genetic predispositions, or is it the effect of a child's unfortunate upbringing?
Behaviorist view of learning is a psychological approach to learning which is mainly based on the idea that all behaviors are learned through interaction with the environment. Second is the behavioral view of learning generally assumes that the outcome of learning is change in behavior and as the interaction takes place with the environment. Therefore, the external events of the environment also have impact on individuals' learning.
It means that kind of experience any individual is getting in a particular environment, it affects the learning of that individual. Now, there are some basic assumptions of behaviorism as an approach to learning. First point is environment. Environment plays key role in the learning of all behaviors. It means whatever learning takes place, interaction with the environment is necessary aspect. Second, this approach is scientific in nature. It means that measurement and observation of behavior is important point of it. It emphasizes on the importance of observable behavior. And the next assumption is that there is a little difference in the learning process of human and animals. This is evident from the many experiments of behaviors theorists where animals were taken to the process of learning and their behavior was modified. With the various laws of learning, behavior is the result of association of stimulus and response.
Who is B.F. Skinner?
B.F. Skinner or Burrhus Frederick Skinner is an American psychologist, author, inventor, advocate for social reform, and poet. Innovated his own philosophy of science called radical behaviorism. Also one of the supporters of behaviorism along with Watson, Pavlov, and Thorndike. Was born in March 20, 1904, died August 18, 1990. Operant conditioning is based on idea that we can increase or decrease a certain behavior by adding a consequence. For example, if a dog poops on a carpet, we can either provide reinforcement so the dog does it again, or punishment so the dog stops. Both reinforcement and punishment can either be positive or negative, which means we have 4 possible ways to teach this dog a lesson. We can draw 4 options in a table. If reinforcement is positive, we add something pleasant like a cookie to increase the likelihood of a behavior. If reinforcement is negative, we still want to increase the desired behavior, this time by removing something pleasant like the leash. If punishment is positive, we add the unpleasant response to decrease the behavior. When punishment is negative, we also want to decrease behavior now by removing something pleasant like comfy carpet. If we stop any sort of manipulation, the conditioned behavior will eventually disappear again. This is called extinction. Operant conditioning was first studied by Edward L. Thorndike and later made famous by the work of B.F. Skinner. Skinner believed that organisms are doing what they really do naturally until they accidentally encounter a stimulus that creates conditioning which results in a change of behavior. To test this, he placed a rat inside an operant conditioning chamber which later became known as the Skinner box. Among other things, inside the box was a lever that would release food when pressed. Conditioning happens in a three terms contingency today, known as the ABCs of behavior. A stands for antecedent. The rat accidentally hits the lever that triggers the release of the food. B stands for behavior and refers to the response. The rat keeps pressing the lever. C stands for consequence. Food keeps coming out. The strength of the response to the conditioning depends on the schedule of the reinforcement. If there is always food after pressing, the rat behaves predictably. If the food is released randomly, the rat behaves erratically, like an addict. Skinner was born on 1904, was a professor of psychology and subscribed to behaviorism. He argued that you can only study behavior that is visible, and anything happen only within the mind is either a misconception or irrelevant to science. He thought free will was an illusion because behavior is either random or a reaction to the environment. His work became the foundation of behavioral therapy, military drills, and animal training. You can try this classroom exercise and positive reinforcement. One individual must exit the room. Now decide on a task which that individual will complete, such as finding a particular book. Then choose an honorable way of reinforcing that task, such as clapping your hands. Invite the person to come back into the room and let them try and complete the task, but don't give any instructions. Every time they are on the right track in regards to completing the task, clap your hands louder. If they moved away from performing the task, reduce their applause or stop it entirely. Once the person understands what they are supposed to do, let them explain the task. There are 4 types of schedule reinforcement. First, fixed ratio schedule. Second, variable ratio schedule. Third, fixed interval schedule. And lastly, variable interval schedule. Fixed ratio schedule is a behavior that is reinforced after a set number of responses have occurred. For example, a student may be given a bar of Kit Kat chocolates for every 10 mathematical problems solved. Variable ratio schedule. In a variable ratio schedule, the number of responses needed to gain reinforcement is not constant. Like, for example, rewards could be given after 3, 5, 9, and 15 mathematical problems solved. Third, fixed interval schedule is a behavior that will be reinforced after a certain period of time. No matter how often it occurs, the behavior will not be reinforced until the time is up. Like, for example, students are given a quiz every Wednesday. Variable interval schedule also based on time passing, but the time period keep on changing. Like, for example, students are given pop quizzes. Dangers of punishment. Punishment can be abusive. Like, for instance, a teacher might become so aroused when he is punishing a student that he becomes abusive. Punishment may create a new problem that is aggression. For instance, students commonly react to physical punishment by learning to dislike the punisher and perhaps by reacting aggressively toward that person. Thus, punishment does not convey any information about what an alternative and more appropriate behavior might be. It may suppress one inappropriate behavior only to be replaced by another one. Punishment can turn out to be reinforcing. A student might learn that misbehaving will get the teacher's attention.